Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, Jules and I review the Mamiya Sekor Z 50mm f4.5 W lens for the Mamiya RZ67. This lens is pretty wide, so the 50mm would translate to around 24mm focal length on a typical 35mm camera. And given the 6x7 negative size and the typical medium format depth of field, you do get a very nice characteristic look in combination with this wide angle focal length here. And it is well suited for shooting environmental portraits, landscapes, architecture, and even close-ups, which makes this lens here particularly interesting. The Mamiya RZ67 is famous for its standard lens, the 110mm f2.8 lens, which is fantastic, but at the same time I also felt like this is such a great camera and I really want to use it with other focal length as well. So I occasionally looked left and right to extend the lens lineup, and was particularly curious about the wide angle range because I had made really good experiences with a wide angle lens on the Hasselblad and a 6x6 medium format camera, especially when shooting portraits. And I was kind of looking for something like that, and then suddenly Jules pointed me in the direction of a classified ad showcasing this particular lens here for a great price of only 150 euros. So I took the plunge, and when it came I could see, okay, it is heavily used and it even has a dent here, a prominent one around the lens here, and yet the lens cap still fit, and most importantly the optical condition of the lens is excellent, so no concerns here, it's just working wonderfully, and also the aperture ring and the overall operation just works fine. So this was quite a bargain for probably cosmetic reasons, and since I'm just an occasional wide-angle shooter, I also went for this lens and not, please don't confuse it with this one, the significantly more expensive ULD FLE version of this lens. So there is a more expensive one that comes with, as the name suggests, an ultra-low dispersion lens and a floating lens element. That's what the FLE stands for, and we will get to that in a minute a bit more. So, as always, we took the lens through its paces, shooting it in and around Munich, for instance, in Haar, where we had done some shootings in the past, close to a conveyor belt and some plants and some landscape situations and so on, so pretty diverse. I also took it out to the botanical garden here in Munich, especially shooting some close-ups. And then I was super curious about how it would perform, especially for environmental portraits on black and white film and things like that. So I also got a model from Most Wanted models and took some images with this one here. So without further ado, let's take a closer look at the lens, its features, and most importantly, how it performs. So this 50mm Sekor Z or Z lens was introduced in 1982 and stands in the tradition of the original 50mm Sekor C lens, like Caesar salad here. And that came with a dedicated floating element and a ring to control that floating element, and that might be interesting because many people are confusing these two lenses, and also in the forums there's a lot of confusion about that ring. And the point here is that these retrofocus wide-angle lenses tend to have a small problem, and that is a curved field of focus at closer distances to your subject instead of a plane one that you would expect and want. And in order to compensate for that, there's an additional floating element inside that you can control to correct based on the distance to your subject that is in focus. And that is particularly important at closer distances. In regular use, and if you're further away from your subject, you could just leave it at infinity and you're good to go. But for close-ups, it is recommended to use it. This particular later lens here that we are discussing does not have that floating element. Instead, it comes with a pretty complex 11 elements in 9 groups design, and the aperture range goes from f4.5 to f32, and the minimum focusing distance is 45 millimeters thanks to the bellows focusing of the Mamiya RZ67, which of course allows for quite some versatility and flexibility when shooting close-ups, and it lets you create really interesting results. The filter thread is 77 millimeters and as such the same like on the 110 millimeter standard lens, for instance, and that of course is nice because then you can switch around with your accessories and filters and so on without any kind of trouble. The lens weighs 760 grams, which is of course quite heavy, and yet with the dimensions of 97 to 82 millimeters, it is significantly more compact than the larger, heavier and more expensive ULD FLE version that I've mentioned before. Of course, it is a much more professional lens, the other one, the later one and more expensive one. And yet, when you're just an occasional wide-angle shooter, you're still getting a professional lens here that lives up to all sorts of professional standards, certainly the ones in the 1980s, but I would argue it's still a fantastic lens today. The lens naturally comes with a built-in Sekor leaf shutter supporting speeds from 8 seconds to 1/400th of a second, plus a T mode and a bulb mode. And it also supports X-Sync flash and features a flash sync terminal. So what about the optical performance and the results? The lens is very sharp, even when shot wide open. There's only some slight vignetting towards the corners, but once you stop down to f5.6 and especially f8, these completely disappear and you get a tack sharp image across the entire frame. The bokeh is very pleasant and creamy, I would call it, and particularly works well with environmental portraits and situations like that. It really helps the whole lens and the wide angle lens in combination with the medium format size here of the negative really helps isolate your subject and create a really nice 3D pop, for lack of a better word. So I really appreciated that, especially at the closer and mid distances, and yet it's also well suited for shooting architecture and landscape. But speaking of architecture, please note that this kind of lens comes with quite a visible barrel distortion, which is common for these kinds of wide-angle lenses on a medium format camera, at least to some extent. But then of course you can accentuate that effect or make it worse when slightly tilting your camera when you're supposed to just hold it steady and as level as possible in the face of your subject. And Jules kind of jokingly said to me, hey, when seeing my first results, he might give me a bubble level for my next birthday, and highly recommended to just put the camera on a tripod, make sure that it's level when shooting these kinds of straight lines and trying to capture architecture, because otherwise the slightest tilt will really create strong effects of barrel distortion here. It's not a problem at all when shooting environmental portraits, I would argue, because then these effects kind of add to the dynamic and to the drama in the image, so really pulls you in and creates these crazy wild lines in the background depending on your situation and the setting that you have. So that can also be a nice creative effect, but if you really want to shoot architecture, just try to keep it as clean and well structured as possible. In my opinion, the lens truly shines for especially landscape shots, but also architecture and the mid-distance portraits. At closer distances, it's still working okay, but sometimes you get these pretty warped images that are a little bit crazy and busy in the background. Especially with busier backgrounds, you immediately capture that effect and then have a potentially warped and busy bokeh. So ideally, you isolate your subject when you do the close-up and have a very clean background, and in these cases it really feels like the lens has wrapped itself around your subject and really put the film plane on top of it and then captured everything on a plane, film plane, and that I personally really like, that you're being so drawn into that image when getting so close to the subject, and it really creates a special effect in my opinion. The color reproduction is fantastic, and we didn't encounter any problems when it comes to ghosting or flaring. And overall, I would say this is the kind of professional lens that you would expect from a Mamiya Sekor Z lens. And yet it only costs 150 to 300 euro, as I've indicated earlier. So it can actually be had for relatively little money or be quite a bargain, depending on where you look. And I would argue it's being overshadowed by the significantly more expensive ULD FLE version that is, of course, significantly better, but the other lens here is also a professional lens, and depending on how often you would use it, I would say it's just smarter to go for the cheaper one if it's just about complementing your lens lineup, as in my case. So what about the handling and my personal impressions? Mounting and using the lens is very easy and straightforward. The aperture clicks feel very nice and click nicely into place. They feel just like on any other Mamiya RZ67 lens. The filter size is convenient, as I've mentioned before, and it's just very important to keep the lens straight and the camera straight to make sure that you don't get these kinds of distortions. Otherwise, just bring a tripod and make sure that you're looking out for that. I particularly liked using this lens for the portraits and the closer mid-distance shots, precisely because it helps you to create this very characteristic look that comes with quite a nice bokeh, quite a nice foreground-background separation, and there's still a wide-angle shot that draws you into the image. So all sorts of things that I really like and appreciate. I personally particularly liked it for shooting these deliberate architecture shots, even if they could have been more deliberate, and isolating individual subjects or shooting the portraits. That, in my opinion, brings out all the qualities of this lens here. And if you are like me and only occasionally want to shoot a 50mm lens, I would argue this is the best choice for the RZ67, because you get fantastic optical quality, you get really great results, you have a nice and relatively compact lens that is also easy to move around with when handheld during a portrait session or something like that. It is still possible to handle it quickly, so to speak. And yet, if you prefer to spend more money and get a significantly better corrected lens, then of course perfectly fine. But if you are like me, I would argue this is the best deal for the money that you can get in terms of getting a professional lens that is highly corrected, that feels well, that is well crafted and created, and yet creates these special images, draws people in, and doesn't break the bank. So overall, a really nice package that I can highly recommend taking a look at if you're in the market for a 50mm lens or similar. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and our review of the Mamiya Sekor Z 50mm f4.5W lens, a solid performer which offers great sharpness, contrast, color reproduction and feeling, for lack of a better word, but also some slight distortions and vignetting, especially when shot wide open. Overall, still a lot of lens for the money, and at least for my lens collection, it's a great addition, and I'm really happy that I found it and had so much joy with it. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg, and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.